are now on a collision course with the end of the semester. I have a couple of things I'd like to do before we get to our most honored lecturer, and I have some announcements. I sent to all of the sections, and I think, Barbara, you received it as well, the Governor Schwarzenegger's proclamation about the Armenian Genocide. I hope you'll take an opportunity to look at it in your email. As we go through the calendar, we all are aware of the fact, or hopefully we're aware, that there is going to be a significant rally in San Francisco on Sunday, April 30th. We had an announcement about it before break. I have some more handouts. Barbara reminds us that you need to register online to be able to be on the bridge. So if you want to be on the bridge on Sunday, you need to email www.ourpledge.org. And we'll have some more of these for you to pick up. They'll be on the table. On May 10th and 11th, we are going to show a video. This is in place of regular section attendance. You can take your pick. You can go to either one. It's going to be shown in the library in Schultz 2015. And the name of the video is Into the Arms of Strangers. And the reason we've arranged it this way is because it's a little bit longer than most of the sections. So the first showing will be on May 10th, which is a Wednesday, from 9 to 11:15. And the second one will be on May 11th from 4 to 6:15. Doesn't matter which section you're in, you may go to either one. Okay, so if you're in the late night, almost time to put on our pajamas section on Thursday, you can come. There's plenty of room for you on Wednesday at 9 o'clock. We were very, very successful during the last, I feel like I'm a televangelist. We were extremely successful at our last lecture. If we get all of our pledges, almost $325 to send to SaveDarfur.org. It's in the nature of what we do here that we can't invite people to come back every single year, although we would like to, because we only have 16 weeks and we have some obligations about the things that we have to do. So this year we were unable to invite Mathilde Mukadabana, who is a Rwandan survivor. We have contributed to an orphanage that she runs in Rwanda. And Barbara saw her, was it last night? Would you like to report what she had to say?
Yeah, well, for the last 2 years, we've had Mathilde here speaking to us, and we've collected money, and she's gone back every summer and is working with 2 groups of students. Initially, she was working with young girls and training them in sewing skills, which was some way that they would be able to support themselves as they grew older. What she said is this summer, the boy rebelled and said, "Me too." And she said that our contributions last year made an enormous difference, and that this year she was going back and they were setting up specialized programs for the boys as well. And she hopes to join us again next year. Last year we had the real privilege of having 2 of our students who had been in the lecture series and who went with Mathilde to Rwanda to actually work with those children. And it was probably the most moving presentation we've ever had, to have our former students from this very class speak about their experience and share some slides of their trip to Rwanda and their time working with those students. So we'd like to
pass the bowl. This bowl was a gift from Mathilde the first time she came. A child can go to school for a whole year on $5 in Rwanda. So we'll pass this around and ask for you to give whatever it is that you can, and we will pass this on for the bill. This is an organization that we have adopted.
Friends of Rwanda.
Friends of Rwanda. If you'd like to write a check, Friends of Rwanda. I have one last thing I'd like to say today. Today is Holocaust Remembrance Day. Today is Holocaust Remembrance Day, and every year, Yad Vashem, which is the Holocaust Remembrance Authority in Israel, picks a theme. And in the past, the themes have been "To Everyone There Is a Name," and has been a part of their ongoing project to collect the names of as many people who were victims of the Nazis as possible. In the past, there has also been one that says, "We will remember." This year, I think it's very apt that the theme is, "I will remember." We do a very good job of remembering, but I would ask you today to spend some time quietly remembering some of the people that you've read about, some of the people that you've met as survivors. And to say to yourself, also pledge, "I will remember." That brings us to today's lecture. We also remember that before there was a Holocaust, there was a genocide in Armenia. And it's become very common to talk about the fact that Hitler, when confronted with the notion that he was doing something that people wouldn't like when he aimed to eliminate the Jews, his remark supposedly was, "Who remembers the Armenians?" Well, we do, and we also remember how important it is to remember that there were a whole group of people almost 40 years before the Holocaust who suffered horrible indignation and death and genocide, and that the Armenian Genocide was the first one in the 20th century. We are most privileged today to have with us Dr. Robert Korian, who was here last year. I don't want to make him feel nervous, but he did a really great job last year. And that's the reason we invited him back. And if he wants to be invited back again. So let me tell you a little bit about him. Robert Korian is a diplomatic historian in the Policy Studies Division of the Office of the Historian of the State Department. He specializes in historical studies for senior State Department officials. He is also a professorial lecturer at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University, and he teaches courses on the Caucasus and Eurasia, and he is also a research associate at George Washington's Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies. He obtained his doctorate in history and Eurasian studies from Harvard, and he specializes in the history and politics of Russia and Eastern Europe, the Caucasus, and Central Asia. He also earned an MA in Near Eastern Languages and Civilization from Harvard, and an MA in Political Science from George Washington University. We are most privileged to have him with us, and I would ask you to welcome Dr. Korian.
Not that there's any pressure on me today, but thank you very much for coming. And I'd like to thank Professor Myrna Goodman and Christine Davidian at Sonoma State for arranging my lecture and for inviting me back. It's a real pleasure. I had a wonderful time last year, so I'm glad to be able to join with you again this year. And I have to give my standard disclaimer that I'm here in my capacity as a George Washington University professor and not as an official of the State Department. So what I say is my personal opinion and does not necessarily reflect the opinions of the U.S. government. Having said that, the public service announcement. First of all, the subject of the Armenian Genocide is far too complex to squeeze into one short lecture. So what I would like to do today is to try to give a brief overview and then address the theme of living with genocide, which is the subject of, I think, the overarching theme of this year's lectures. And then at the end of the lecture, I'd be more than happy to answer questions, because I think sometimes we have a better discussion when it's a give and take than when I just stand up here and talk. And I remember last year, one of the suggestions was to try to bring a map so that people could orient themselves to where Armenia is. And what I've been able to do is to bring a map that shows the Armenian Genocide, the deportation routes, and the concentrations of mass murder sites. And just to orient you, it's a little bit squished because we had to get it on the screen, but to the north is the Black Sea, and to the west is the Mediterranean, and you have Bulgaria and Greece, and then you'll see Kurdistan and Mesopotamia, which is today's Iraq. So the cities Mosul, Kirkuk, etc. might be familiar to you as you read the news about what's going on in Iraq. So just in terms of geographic orientation, I think it's very important to keep in mind that Armenia is at the crossroads of empires. And I know that the use of the term crossroads is somewhat cliched, but in this case it really is true. The Armenians are the indigenous inhabitants of this region. The first written record of them is from 518 BC, so they have an ancient cultural heritage. They converted to Christianity in around 301 AD, the first nation, the first kingdom to do so before the formation of the Catholic Church. They had various kingdoms and principalities throughout the ancient and medieval period. And then beginning in the 7th century, we had the Islamic Empire bursting out of the Arabian Peninsula and spreading throughout North Africa, the Near East, into Armenia, Central Asia, the Caucasus, etc. And then following the establishment of Islamic rule in Armenia, we had various waves of Turkic nomadic invaders that swept through the area and settled on Armenian land. So the Ottoman Empire came about as a result of these nomadic waves that came into Armenia beginning in around the 10th or 11th century. Now, this is an area that's really at the crossroads of imperial frontiers. It was at the frontier of Rome and later Byzantium and the Persian Empire, the Sasanians. In the more modern period, it has been at the crossroads of Turkey, Iran, and Russia. And that meant that the Armenian lands were divided between these various empires. And that's going to be very important as our discussion continues. So the Armenians became, from being the indigenous inhabitants of this land, they became subjects of the Ottoman Empire. We can't talk about citizenship because the notion of citizenship is a modern concept and it didn't exist in those days. But there was the notion of being a subject. And according to Islamic law, Jews and Christians are supposed to be protected. They're called peoples of the book because in Islamic philosophy, the Old Testament is respected, as is the New Testament, but it was supposed to have been superseded by the revelation to the Prophet Muhammad. Despite being protected, it was protection with the notion that you were a second-class citizen. And that's also a second-class subject. We didn't have citizenship. You had certain restrictions. You couldn't bear arms. You couldn't ride on horses. You couldn't have any of your churches higher than a mosque, for example. You had to wear special clothes. You had to eat special food. And your testimony was not accepted in court. So you were protected as long as you knew your place. And that is a common theme that, in this part of the world that we come across starting from around the 18th century onwards. So what the Ottoman Empire did is they created a system called the millet system, M-I-L-L-E-T. In each of these communities, Armenian, Greek, Jewish, Assyrian, etc., were organized into not so much ethnic groups, but ethno-religious communities. They had a certain amount of internal autonomy so that the Armenian church, for example, was able to run its own affairs, again, within certain limits that the Ottoman state set in motion. Now, all of that began to change in the 19th century. Beginning in the 1860s, the Russian Empire was expanding from the north, coming down into the North Caucasus and then the South Caucasus. And at that time, you'll hear about people in the news lately called Chechens. They're one group of North Caucasians. There are also Dagestanis, Circassians, etc. And when the Russians came in and conquered these areas, they then had the peoples of the North Caucasus either submit to their rule or be deported or agree to leave their homelands. And a lot of them went to the Ottoman Empire. So these were largely Muslim peoples. They didn't want to be under Christian Russian rule, so they left and they were accepted in the Ottoman Empire. And where were they settled? They were settled on Armenian land. Now, shortly thereafter, as the Balkan peoples started to rebel against Ottoman rule and establish their independence, more waves of Muslim refugees flooded into the Ottoman Empire. And where did they settle? Again, on Armenian lands. Not only did you, and now this is a classic conflict that we see in many different parts of the world, where you have a settled population, which is the Armenians, and you have newcomers coming in, and there's a fight for resources. Not only is there a fight for resources, for land, etc., these migrants, these refugees, are very angry people. And you can't blame them, right? They've been expelled from their lands, they've lost everything, they've come into an empire that really isn't able to take care of them. The Ottoman state was really not able to take care of them, it had accepted them. And so now they associate their treatment at the hands of Balkan and Russian Christians, and they transfer that anger and that hatred onto the Armenians. Now, added to this mix is an Ottoman state policy of resettling not just the Balkan and North Caucasian Muslims, but also nomadic Kurds. So the Kurds that were living in what's today Iran, Iraq, and Turkey, a lot of them were brought in and settled. Well, they were only semi-settled because they were largely nomadic. And now you had another conflict that's also, we can look at, say, from the perspective of the United States, the rancher versus the farmer, where you have people tending crops, right, on their land, and then you have people that have large herds, large flocks, and those come into conflict. So now the Armenians, by the end of the 1800s, are finding themselves squeezed on these very different ways. There's Muslim migrants that are coming in that are preying on them because they're able, as Muslims, they are first-tier subjects, they are able to be armed, they can ride horses, they can have certain privileges that the Christians can't have. So what you end up having is increasing lawlessness. You have raping, you have looting, you have pillaging. It was not uncommon for nomadic raiders to come into Armenian villages and choose the prettiest women and then take them into their harems, and they were never heard from again. They were lost to the Armenian community, and the Armenian community had no recourse. There was no one to turn to try to gain redress from these depredations. By the late 1880s, early 1890s, the frustration of the Armenians reached a boiling point, and they started to think of ways to defend themselves. So in the early 1890s, a revolutionary movement was born that preached not independence for Armenia, but self-defense. They wanted to live their lives and essentially be left alone by the state. Now, of course, the state would tax, and everyone paid their taxes, but in the Christian case, there was always double or triple taxation. So not only would they be taxed by the state, the nomadic Kurds would come in and demand protection money. They were basically running a racket. That if you paid your money to the Kurds, then they would protect you from other groups of Kurds that could prey on you. It was an early form of the shakedown. So the Armenians began to look for examples, and they saw what was going on in the Balkans. They saw that people in the Balkans, the Orthodox Christians, the Serbs, the Bulgarians, the Greeks, had risen in rebellion and had been able to carve out their independence. And that was viewed as one possible model. In fact, after one of the Russo-Turkish wars, the Russians had made tremendous gains against the Ottomans, and there was a peace conference called, and the other great powers, which is another theme, that the British, the French, the Russians, the Prussians, all were in competition with one another for influence in this part of the region. So Britain was particularly afraid that Russia would become too strong because Britain's preoccupation in the 19th century was its empire in India. Now, India is a very long way away from Armenia, but nonetheless, the trade routes were such that whoever controlled Armenia could then access through Iran, through the Persian Gulf, and somehow threaten British occupation of India. And the main rival to Britain in those days was Russia. So it was very important for the British that the Ottoman Empire be somehow kept intact. So after this Ottoman defeat by the Russians, a peace conference was called, and Armenia was given some sort of autonomy. But then the British, and of course followed by the French, were very concerned about this, so they called another peace conference, and they reversed the decision to give Armenia autonomy. And the patriarch of the Armenian church at the time came up with a very famous story, and it was called the story of the iron ladle. And he used the metaphor of this Middle Eastern porridge. And he said, at the peace conference, people came to dip their iron spoons in the ladle, in the porridge. The Bulgarians came, the Greeks came, the Serbs came. They all got their piece of porridge, and they went on their way. Armenians, however, came to the porridge with a paper ladle. And when they dipped that paper ladle into the porridge, the ladle disintegrated, and the Armenians were left with nothing. Now that was a very clear reference, the iron ladle being self-defense, being arm yourselves, because it is through arming yourselves that you will be able to gain some rights. And now in the late 19th century, this is a time where human rights is starting to become more and more important. Now, the Ottoman response to the attempt of the Armenians to alleviate their suffering came in the form of massacres from 1894 to 1896, a whole 20 years before the beginning of the actual genocide in 1915. Sultan Abdul Hamid, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, decided that Armenian rebelliousness could best be handled by teaching the Armenians a lesson. So he organized throughout the Ottoman Empire a series of massacres where usually a bugle was blown. Troops and irregulars would surround an Armenian village or an Armenian quarter of a city. They would go in, they would rape, loot, pillage, and massacre. And then after a day, 2 days, or 3 days, the bugle would blow again. Everyone would return to barracks or to their normal lives, and the killing would be over. And this went on for several years, resulting in the massacre of about 200,000 to 300,000 Armenians. It meant a tremendous number of orphans, a tremendous number of widows, and it really became a cause célèbre for the West. For example, in the United States, it was really the first international human rights campaign. Clara Barton, the founder of the Red Cross, went to Constantinople, Istanbul, to try to alleviate the suffering of the Armenians. Many, Harriet Beecher Stowe, many other writers had campaigns to try to help alleviate the suffering of the Armenians. It was in all of the newspapers of the day because there were many missionaries in the Ottoman Empire that were writing back, giving eyewitness accounts of what was going on. And then, after the 1890s, things began, if you could imagine, to deteriorate even more. The corruption of the Ottoman Empire was becoming unbearable even for the Turkish subjects and Muslim subjects of the empire. And another revolutionary movement was born of Turks, Arabs, Kurds, Armenians, Slavs, etc., to try to reform the empire. And in 1908, a revolution occurred that overthrew the Sultan and brought in a group known as the Young Turks, or the Committee of Union, led by the Committee of Union and Progress, which preached for equality and fraternity, using the slogans from the French Revolution. Now, as soon as this happened in 1908, the Ottoman Empire was embroiled in a series of catastrophic wars. As soon as the revolution took place, the Austro-Hungarian Empire decided that this would be a good time to move in to Bosnia-Herzegovina, in the, what is from the former Yugoslavia, and occupy that. So, and then shortly thereafter, the Italians, who were latecomers to the imperial race for colonies, decided that North Africa looked appealing. That also belonged to the Ottoman Empire. So they invaded Tripolitania, or what's today Libya, and occupied that in 1910, 1911. And then 1912, 1913, the remaining Balkan powers, Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, got together and they decided to attack the Ottoman Empire and try to push them out of Europe altogether. So at this time, Ottoman losses are quite heavy. They've been pushed out of the Balkans. They're being attacked in North Africa. And as a result of this, a more chauvinistic branch of the Young Turks comes to power, whose ideology is not one of equality, but one of Turkish nationalism, or Turkish supremacism, where the Turkish ethnic core of the empire must be the leading element, and all others must assimilate to that Turkish core or be eliminated. And it's in that context that we can then look at the Armenian Genocide. Now, between 1894 and 1896, what was known as the Hamidian massacres and the actual genocide, there was another series of massacres in the Adana region, which is along the Mediterranean coast. There's a red dot right in this little section. In 1909, where 30,000 Armenians were massacred. So by the standards of the day, not a terribly large massacre, but still 30,000 people is a lot. And this happened under the new regime of the Young Turks. And that brought a lot of suspicion on them by the Armenians. And so gradually the Armenians became alienated from the new rulers, and then with the advent of Turkish nationalism, there was really no room in the empire for them anymore. So when World War I broke out, originally between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and the German Empire on one side, Russia, Britain, and France on the other side, the Ottomans had to make a decision as to which side they would come in on. Now, they could have stayed neutral, of course, but they were hoping to take advantage of European preoccupation, European weakness, to kind of consolidate their own empire. And because this was a period of Turkish nationalism, the Turks were now looking east. So they were looking to Iran and Central Asia, which was largely occupied by ethnic Turks. And they had this dream of unifying all the Turks of the world into this one pan-Turkic empire. In October of 1914, they put in their lot with the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians. And shortly thereafter, they launched a massive assault on the Russian border in the Caucasus, which happened to be the areas populated by Armenians. They did this in December. It was led by one of it's called the Triumvirate. There were three main rulers of the Ottoman Empire. One of them was Enver Pasha, who was a real Germanophile, had been military attaché in Berlin, was very fond of German military accomplishments. And so, with a force of about 100,000 men, he assaulted the Russian line in December. And if you know anything about that part of the world, it is highly inhospitable terrain, and the weather really worked against him, and his army was shattered. So out of about 100,000 men, close to 90,000 of them were killed. Not necessarily in battle. A lot of them froze to death because they didn't have proper equipment. Many of them died from disease, and then some of them died from actual fighting. Now, Enver couldn't accept this defeat on his own, so he looked around for a scapegoat. And because some Armenians that had lived in the Russian Empire were in the Russian army and helping the Russians, and there were some defectors from the Turkish side that also went to fight on the Russian side, this was used as an excuse to once and for all solve the Armenian question under cover of war. And of course, the best way to solve the Armenian question is to remove the Armenians completely from the scene. And if you have no Armenians, you have no Armenian question. So in fact, yesterday, which was April 24th, is the day in 1915 that the Armenians commemorate the beginning of the genocide. Because on that day in Constantinople, what is now Istanbul, the Ottoman government rounded up hundreds of Armenian intellectuals, doctors, lawyers, teachers, priests, engineers, the intellectual cream of the Armenian nation. They rounded them up not only in Constantinople, but in other cities around the empire, and they eventually murdered them. That was stage one, because what happens then is that your community is now without its leaders. Then, because the war was on and the Armenian men had been drafted into the Ottoman army, they were then segregated out, their weapons were taken away, they were put in labor battalions, and they were either worked to death or executed. And that's stage two. So now the intellectuals are gone, the leadership is gone, and now the men are gone as well. So that leaves who? That leaves the women, the children, and the elderly. And so an order for deportation was carried out throughout the empire. Technically, the law on deportation said that the Armenians were being removed from the war zone for their own good, and because they were an unreliable element in the empire and couldn't be trusted, they were going to be relocated, and then after the war, they would be allowed to come back. And on paper, that sounded reasonable. Except that the way the Young Turk government worked is that there were the written orders, and then the Committee of Union and Progress sent out its emissaries throughout the empire, and this you could liken to the German government versus the Nazi Party, or the Soviet government and the Bolshevik Party, where you had parallel structures, but the real power center lay with the party, not the state. So oral orders went out through emissaries, saying, ignore the written orders, the deportation means massacre, and that neither women nor children nor the elderly shall be spared. And what you see on the map are the main concentrations of the massacres, and the arrows and the lines are the death marches. So what they did is they usually gave people anywhere from a few hours to a few days to supposedly liquidate all of their belongings. You know, and some of the Armenians in the towns were fairly wealthy. They sold everything at a pittance or gave everything away. All they could take was what they could carry on their backs. And then they were put on a march. And they were just marched to death in many cases. They would just keep going from one place to another until they fell from exhaustion. Or the Ottoman government would allow the nomadic Kurds to intervene and to massacre the Armenians with the promise that they could get whatever they wanted. So if that meant that they could loot whatever meager possessions the Armenians still had, or more importantly, they could take their women. So what you had on these death marches were Kurdish groups attacking Armenian deportee caravans, taking women and young girls, sometimes raping them to death, sometimes taking them into their harems, and the children raising as Muslims, the wives converting, the women converting them to Islam, and thus the process was fairly complete almost by the end of 1916. So it began in the spring of 1915, and it continued in various waves throughout 1915 and 1916, when most of the Armenians had already been eliminated. Of course, the Ottoman Empire was not the most efficient and smoothly running place on earth, so sometimes things would get overlooked and there would be pockets of Armenians that hadn't been cleaned out. So continuing 1917 and 1918, there were additional massacres to try to remove the remnants of the Armenian people. Now, not all Armenians went to their deaths like sheep, although the overwhelming majority of them did. In fact, many of those elders that were still left in the community, say a parish priest or an elderly man, they usually said, let us just go on we're only being deported, let's not believe the worst, and then when the war is over, we'll be able to return. But a lot of people didn't believe that. And so in a few instances in the Ottoman Empire, Armenians did get together and they did resist. These were men that had deserted from the Ottoman army or had gone underground. Sometimes women, a lot of times 15, 16-year-old boys. And in a few places they resisted. And one of the most famous instances of resistance was on the coast of the Mediterranean, near Adana. There's a place called Musadal, and you can see there's kind of a star-shaped image there. The Armenians in Musadal, which means the mountain of Moses, had seen the surrounding Armenian villages deported. Word had gotten back that the Armenians had been massacred, and so when they got their deportation order, they decided to resist. They decided to go up into the mountains and to fight. And the rationale was, we're dead anyway. So if we are to die, then we should at least die with dignity and die with arms in our hands and try to redeem the honor of the Armenian nation. So for over 40 days, they resisted the Turkish assault until finally a French warship that was in the Mediterranean saw their SOS signal and picked them up and rescued them. And then they were brought and resettled in various communities in the Middle East. And I'll get back to why that is important and an important connection to the Holocaust shortly. So by the time that World War I ends in October of 1918, the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire have largely been eliminated. But the Armenians in the Russian Empire, after the Russian Revolution of 1917, were able to organize themselves and declare an independent state on this tiny little bit of Armenian land that's in the far right corner. You see a city named Yerevan. It was just a little portion of the historic Armenian homeland that was still occupied by Armenians, and they declared independence in 1918. Now, given their weakened state, unfortunately, they weren't able to keep that independence for too long. So by 1920, the Bolshevik Russia was on the rise and was gathering in all of the lands that had once belonged to the Russian Empire but that had broken away, including the Caucasus. And on the Turkish side, the Ottoman Empire had been defeated, and a resistance movement came into being led by Mustafa Kemal Pasha, They were known as the Turkish nationalists or the Kemalists. And they were fighting to preserve what they saw as the core of the Turkish heartland, which happened to have overlapped to a large extent with Armenia, and to kick out the British and the French that were occupying large parts of their land. So Kemal, who was anti-Western, an anti-imperialist, anti-British, anti-French, came to an agreement with Vladimir Lenin, who was also an anti-imperialist, and they decided that together they would overthrow and destroy Armenia so that they could link up and broaden their struggle against the imperial powers. So unfortunately, Armenia was too weakened by the massacres that had taken place. The little republic that had been declared was flooded with destitute refugees. People were dying at the rate of 1,000 a day. It was called the land of stalking death. And there was no way, given the circumstances, that Armenia could have existed as an independent republic. Now, what is the aftermath of this? The Armenians have been eliminated from the majority of their homeland. Their civilization of several thousand years was completely wiped out. Their monasteries, their churches, their manuscripts, their libraries, all the material culture that they had created over thousands of years was wiped off the face of the earth. So Armenians were scattered to the four corners. They had communities in the Middle East, notably in Syria, Lebanon, Iran, Egypt. They had the communities in the United States began to grow. New York, Boston, Chicago, Detroit, Fresno, Los Angeles. In various European countries, in France, in South America, etc. This Armenian diaspora really began to grow. Now, it existed before 1915, but it really came into being largely as a result of the genocide, and Armenian diaspora identity is very much linked with the genocide of 1915, because most of us would not be here today in this country were it not for what had happened in 1915. So what are the implications for Armenia and the Armenians? And this kind of gets into the living with genocide part of the lecture. Well, there are short-term, medium-term, and long-term implications. The short-term, obviously, is the removal from their ancestral land and their elimination as a people. There's the trauma associated with the crime among the survivors, and you've been discussing all semester, and you've spoken to Holocaust survivors, so that trauma is very real and very alive. And then for the third thing for short term is that they didn't have the wherewithal to survive in the Republic the onslaught of the Turkish and Russian armies because they had been so weakened. And then the implications of the medium term is that Armenia disappears behind the borders of the Soviet Union for the next 7 decades and is no longer a voice on the international stage. No one hears their complaints, no one hears their cries, and it's the Armenian communities abroad that are left with trying to struggle for recognition of the Armenian genocide. In the long term, Armenia became independent again in 1991 after the Soviet Union fell, but it was burdened with the memory of the Armenian genocide. It was not just burdened with the memory of the Armenian genocide, it was burdened by the fact that the Turkish government refused to acknowledge that such a crime had taken place. And as a result, the Turkish government decided that they would not establish diplomatic relations with the Armenian Republic, and in fact, to this day, the border between Armenia and Turkey is blockaded from the Turkish side. There are no diplomatic relations between Turkey and Armenia has a tremendous sense of vulnerability and fear. Now, how can the Turkish government deny such a crime took place? First of all, what is the evidence? What evidence do we have that a genocide did take place? Just like in the case of the Holocaust, we still have never come across a document with the signature of Adolf Hitler that says exterminate all the Jews. Does that mean the Holocaust didn't happen? Did that mean that Adolf Hitler didn't know what was going on? Did that mean it wasn't part of his worldview? Of course not. So in the Armenian case, we have eyewitness testimony. Not just the Armenian survivors, who one could dismiss as biased, having lived through the atrocities, but there are other eyewitnesses. There are diplomatic personnel from the Allied countries. There were largely Americans. There were also some British and French. But more importantly, there were eyewitnesses from the German and Austrian side that was allied with the Ottoman Empire, and they had no desire to blacken the name of the Turks, but in all of their diplomatic correspondence back to the foreign ministry in Berlin and to the embassy in Constantinople, they wrote voluminous reports about the extermination of the Armenians. And they used the word race extermination. And all of the documents that we see in German and in the U.S. archives talk about this attempt to eliminate an entire nation. The British compiled what's called the British Blue Book that has eyewitness testimony that was checked and double-checked and goes into excruciating and gruesome detail as to what happened to the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire. If any of you are ever in Washington, D.C., you can go to the National Archives and Records Administration, and all of the records from the United States Diplomatic Corps in the Ottoman Empire is there. The U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, Henry Morgenthau, wrote back to Washington voluminous reports begging the U.S. government to somehow intervene to save the Armenians. Henry Morgenthau was a friend of Woodrow Wilson's and an American Jew, and he was offered the post of U.S. ambassador to the Ottoman Empire in 1913, and he didn't want it. He said, the Ottoman Empire post was considered a lesser importance, and it would go to a Jew. And he said, I'm insulted by that, and I don't want anything to do with it. But some of his Jewish supporters said, it may not be such a bad post to take after all, because the Zionist movement is trying to send Jews to Ottoman Palestine. So you might actually be in a position to protect, the Zionists in migration to Palestine. But he was there as the American ambassador. He intervened on behalf of the Armenians. And he went to one of the other triumvirs, Talat Pasha, and said that you have to stop the massacre of the Armenians. And Talat said, what do you care? You're a Jew. We don't do anything to the Jews. And he said, I am not here as a Jew. I am here as a human being. And as a representative of the United States, I am 97% Christian. But I am speaking to you in the name of humanity, and I beg you to stop. And Talat said, what are you whining about? The Armenian question is resolved because there are no more Armenians. Lastly, in terms of evidence, so we have eyewitness testimony, we have numerous documents. And then in the end of 1918, 1919, when the Ottoman capital of Constantinople was occupied by the Allies and a new, more friendly government came into power, they actually instituted a Turkish military tribunal to try the leaders of the Young Turk faction that dragged them into the war. And one of the main articles against them was organizing the massacre of the Armenians. A lot of documentation was entered into, and it was confirmed as authentic. Now, some people complain and say, well, this was clearly a kangaroo court. It was under Allied jurisdiction. And I guess the same could be said of Nuremberg as well. It was victor's justice. But does that mean that just because the Allies won the war in World War II, that all of the evidence entered into Nuremberg was false? Absolutely not. So the Turks themselves had lots of evidence against the organizers of the genocide. And in fact, they declared the three leading players guilty, and they sentenced them to death in absentia. So Cemal Pasha, who was Minister of Marine Talat Pasha, who was the Minister of the Interior, and Enver Pasha, who was Minister of War, and several others as well. They condemned to death in absentia, but these men had already fled abroad and weren't available for the institution of justice. However, justice was meted out because Armenians that had survived the genocide took it into their own hands to execute the sentences. So in 1921, Talat Pasha had fled to Berlin and was living a life in Berlin as an exile, when a young Armenian tracked him down and in broad daylight assassinated him. The young Armenian, Solomon Talerian, was immediately arrested, put on trial in Germany, in a German court in Berlin, at the same time that Adolf Hitler was living in Berlin. It was in the daily newspapers about this trial. And lo and behold, there was so much evidence against Talat Pasha that the assassin was acquitted. He had committed the murder in broad daylight. There were witnesses, but nonetheless, he was acquitted. Cemal Pasha, who had fled to Bolshevik Russia, was also tracked down and assassinated, as was Enver Pasha, who had these dreams of Turkic Empire. He had fled to Russia and then to Russian Central Asia, and he was killed today in what is today Tajikistan, which is all the way out near the Chinese border, because he was trying to resurrect this notion of a pan-Turkic empire. There were several others, Dr. Nazim, Dr. Behadi Shakir, that were also hunted down in Rome and assassinated by Armenians. This was known as Operation Nemesis. But then, of course, Armenia becomes part of the Soviet Union, the Cold War, the 20s and 30s, then there's World War II, the Cold War, etc., and the Armenian issue just falls off of the agenda. And of course, after World War II, the Armenian tragedy is far outshadowed by the horrors of the Holocaust that have been found on film when the Allied troops liberated the concentration camps. Just the level of horror was such that everything else paled in comparison. So because of that, because of the complex international situation at the time, the Turks were able to whitewash their crimes against the Armenians. And they were able to set themselves up just like they had been in the Ottoman Empire, where people were courting them for their favor. So, by the end of World War II, for example, Turkey declared war against the Nazis in the spring of 1945, just weeks before the war was over, so that they could be a founding member of the United Nations. Then, of course, the Soviet Union, Stalin, was flush with victory in the war and decided that he was, he'd already occupied Eastern Europe, and that he was going to put claims on the eastern part of Turkey on behalf of Soviet Armenia. And many Armenians abroad actually supported Stalin in this, because they thought it would be a way to reunify Armenian lands, and then many of them would actually be able to repatriate to Armenia and live on their ancestral lands. Unfortunately, Stalin's heavy-handedness and the staunch Western response consigned this activity to oblivion. Although many Armenians actually did repatriate, thousands of them, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of Armenians repatriated from all over the world to go back to live in Armenia, which sounds crazy that you would give up a different lifestyle and go live in the Stalinist Soviet Union. But you have to understand, in 1945, it was the Soviets that were viewed as the victors over the Nazi war machine. And there was a certain flush of enthusiasm that maybe the Soviet system wasn't as bad as everyone said. So many Armenians went back to Armenia, where they either never stepped foot on land, they actually were deported right away to Central Asia and Siberia, or they were allowed to live in Armenia very briefly and then sent to jail. So that experiment was a complete failure. But what did the West do? Well, the West became very alarmed because Stalin had promised free elections in Eastern Europe, and he just kept his Red Army there. And then, when he put claims on Turkey, President Truman said, well, enough is enough. And then we have the Truman Doctrine, where the U.S. would support any country that was willing to take on communist aggression, which meant that Turkey became anchored in the Western Alliance. They became anchored in the Western Alliance even further in 1950s when they actually sent troops to Korea to fight on the United Nations side. And then as the Cold War heated up, clearly Turkey was of strategic importance to the United States because it had the longest land border to the Soviet Union of any NATO country. So for all of these reasons, the ability of the Turkish government and the Turkish state to not acknowledge the Armenian Genocide grew. And so they were able to spend millions of dollars every year to prevent any kind of recognition. So, for example, in 1933, not that long after the Armenian Genocide, MGM wanted to make a movie based on a novel. Now, what novel was this? This was a novel called The 40 Days of Musa Dagh. A Viennese Jew by the name of Franz Werfel went to the Near East in the late 1920s, early 1930s, and went to refugee camps and saw the Armenian survivors of that famous battle on the Mediterranean, the Battle of Musa Dagh. And he wrote a novel that discussed the fighting. It really became a classic, the classic novel on the Armenian Genocide. And in his, when he wrote the book, it came out in 1933, he intended it as a clear warning to Europe's Jews that Hitler was now in power, and it was very important to take note of what was happening. And he used the Armenians as kind of a metaphor. Well, what did the Nazis do? Of course, they banned the book and then they burned it. And so MGM was going to make a movie out of this book. But the Turkish government intervened as early as 1933 to prevent that from happening. And so it really has been consigned to oblivion. And according to the sociologists, denial is the last stage of genocide, because the victims and their descendants are never really able to properly mourn. So, for example, the fact that, I mean, just speaking as an academic, and you look at how well developed Holocaust historiography is, I mean, it's amazing. There's so much detailed research on almost every aspect of the Holocaust. And yet, as Armenians, and people in Armenian studies, and talking about the Armenian Genocide, we are forced to go over the basic outlines of the story time and time again to affirm that it happened. Now, the psychological burden of having to affirm year after year for 91 years that this crime actually took place takes its toll on the development, the psychological development of a people. And so the Armenians are largely burdened with this terrible psychological trauma of not being able to get over, not being able to mourn, and not being able to heal properly. And so for many years, their voices were drowned out by the propaganda of the Turkish state. But in the last few years, there's been a bit of a breakthrough. An increasing number of Turkish academics, many of them located abroad, some in Turkey, have taken issue with the official Turkish line. Now, the official Turkish line has varied over the years, but essentially it says that no genocide occurred, or it was a mutual genocide. Armenians killed Turks, Turks killed Armenians. And then the corollary to that is whatever happened to the Armenians, they deserved it. And that has been the state narrative for generations. And to liken it, we can say in this country, it's only been fairly recently that we have been openly acknowledging what happened to the Native Americans in this country. Where did they go? What happened to them? If you talk to your parents or grandparents and looked in their textbooks at school, you wouldn't find much mention of it. So the Turkish state has kept this line up, and it has drilled it into its population for decades. Just a couple years ago, it actually passed legislation mandating denial of the Armenian Genocide in all of its schools. It wasn't enough to pretend it didn't happen. You had to actively assert that it didn't happen. But many Turkish academics said enough is enough. This state control of our ability to think is detrimental to us as Turks and to our development as a Turkish nation, and they have tried to break this taboo. So there's a professor at the University of Michigan, Professor Goodman, a professor at the University of Minnesota, Taner Akçam. There's a very brave publisher in Turkey, Ragip Zarakoğlu. There are other academics in Turkey like Halil Berktay and Fikret Adaner that have taken on, and there are others as well, and they have taken on this state narrative to say that we have to have an open discussion of what happened to the Armenians. So there is progress being made, but it's slow. And for the Armenians, it's also, the burden is still very, very heavy. And from a personal perspective, I can tell you that growing up in the United States, when I was in grammar school in the 1970s, we were asked to make a family tree. And I couldn't do it. We couldn't do it. We could go to my parents, we could go to my grandparents. In terms of the psychological burden. And then a lot of the Armenians didn't talk about their tragedy. They internalized it. So, for example, when my grandmother died, she was on her deathbed, and she was counting to 5. And she was naming her children. Except that she only had 4 children. And it was only then that we realized that she had lost a child in the genocide. And that we found out that she had fled the village and was being chased down by the Kurds. And when she crossed the river, the baby slipped out. And as she went back to get the baby, her friends grabbed her and said, "No, you'll die too." And there are thousands and hundreds of thousands and millions of these kinds of stories that the Armenians have kept with them over the years. But there's also another side to the story too, and that's, in the case of my family, my grandmother and all of her friends always stressed that we wouldn't be here today if there hadn't been good Turks and good Kurds. And in Armenian, she would say, they're people too. So I think it's now time for the Turkish state to open up and to honor its own heroes, its own righteous Turks. Because in those days under the Ottoman Empire, if you actually gave aid to an Armenian, you were supposed to be hung in front of your home as an example to everyone else. But I think we've come a long way, and I hope that one of these years I will be able to proudly report that the Armenian Genocide has been acknowledged. But until then, we will take whatever opportunity and whatever venue to talk about the Armenian Genocide, and I'm grateful for you all to listen, and I think for the remaining period I will be more than happy to take questions. Thank you.
I think before we take questions, I forgot to do something. I think it was 5 years ago, someone sent me a clipping from a newspaper, Petaluma newspaper, about someone who had organized a group called the Armenians of the North Bay. And I had always wanted to make some connection because I think, we were all really inspired by Robert's personal story about how he felt about growing up as an Armenian. And I've always realized, distanced from it personally, but that the Armenian Genocide is something that we really need to know about for all different kinds of reasons. And so I called Christine Davidian and said, I want to find someone who can do a lecture on the Armenian Genocide. And she was very helpful, and we had discussions back and forth. And I would like you to know that from last year until this year and through other years, Robert appeared, and future lecturers will appear annually to give a lecture on the Armenian Genocide, largely through the hard work and fundraising and devotion of Christine Davidian, and I would like you to acknowledge her. I don't know you personally, but I would like to acknowledge the guests who have come to the lecture. I hope you will come next year as well to hear perhaps even Robert. He did a pretty good job. So questions for Robert? Yes, ma'am.
Was your grandmother, was she empathetic to future genocide? She learned about?
Unfortunately,
Repeat the question, please.
was my grandmother empathetic towards other genocides? Unfortunately, she died when I was very young, so I don't have any memories, but knowing the way my father has reacted, I would say very much so. And in fact, over the years, it was about 10 years ago when, over 10 years now, when the genocide in Rwanda broke out. And I remember writing for the Armenian newspapers saying from Kharkiv, which was my home province, to Kigali, which was the capital of Rwanda, that, the crime of genocide continues. And that it's contingent upon us as Armenians to be in the forefront of confronting these terrible crimes against humanity. And, for example, in Washington, D.C., the Armenian National Committee is at the forefront of trying to raise awareness of what's going on in Darfur. And they've done a wonderful job because I can't speak on behalf of the entire community, but at least many of the politically aware Armenians I know are extraordinarily concerned about, about the crime of genocide. And interestingly, in World War II, there was a resistance leader in the south of France who was a survivor of the Armenian Genocide and joined the French resistance when France fell and was occupied by the Nazis. And he was eventually arrested and executed by the Gestapo. But in the few writings that he left behind, he said that he was moved to help the Jews because of his experience as an Armenian. And I think that experience was fairly common.
Yes.
Could you talk about the experience amongst, did you find this with any Armenian elders where that as being victims and victimized, where that becomes an object of personal shame at some point?
The question was about the Armenian elders and their experience with genocide and it becoming an object of personal shame. In the Armenian case, most of the survivors were women because the men were the first to go. So for many of the women that survived, they were the victims of rape. And because Armenian society was very traditional, it was clearly a mark of shame. And so it really wasn't talked about. And among the sociologists, they talk about, the survivor generation doing just that, surviving. And then the next generation trying to just kind of integrate into the societies that they're now born And it's, for example, my generation that has the luxury of going back and trying to discover their history and trying to put things into perspective. And in the Armenian case, it was very difficult because a lot of the elders didn't want to talk about it. But luckily, beginning in the 1970s, Professor Richard Hovhannisyan at UCLA, along with some others, undertook a massive oral history project and was able to get on videotape thousands of survivor stories before these survivors passed away. Because here we are in 2006, it's been 91 years since the genocide. How many people are left, A, that survived, but B, they had to have been so little, what memories would they even have? So we're lucky in the sense that a lot of this stuff was put on tape, but there are still so many unanswered questions, and that's one of my issues as a scholar, is that I don't have the resource of survivors that I can go to and talk to. And it's extraordinarily, it's just heartrending, because a lot of this history is just lost. It can never be recaptured.
Due to the dissemination of all the Armenians after the genocide, the ones that were able to reconnect, can you speak to some of the methods that allow people to find one another? Because Armenians, the little I know of Armenians, is that they're a very strong community. And were there things in place for them to try to find one another? Because I'm sure many ended up in different countries.
Right. The question is about how did communities try to reconnect and find each other after the genocide. And as I said, although the communities really grew after the genocide, many of them were already in place. So, for example, I was born in Worcester, Massachusetts, which is the oldest Armenian community in the Western Hemisphere. In the 1880s, American missionaries were working Protestant missionaries were working in Armenia, and they recruited workers to come. They thought the Armenians were hard workers, and they recruited them to come to New England to work in the mills. So, for example, they started to come in the 1880s, but they didn't want to stay. The whole point was to get enough money to then send it back home and to buy a plot of land, because they didn't want to leave their homeland. But then the political situation in Armenia deteriorated to such a point that these communities realized that they were probably there to stay. And the first thing that an Armenian community does when it decides to put down roots is it builds a church. And the second thing it does is it builds a school. And that's what happened in my community, and that was in the 1890s. So there's all of this back and forth, right? So, you write a letter to your cousin Hagop and you say, it's not so bad here. And so there are these kinds of connections. And then after the genocide, there was something called the American Near East Relief that raised millions and millions of dollars, billions by today's standards, to try to help those Armenians that survived. And that was due to the philanthropic spirit of the American people. Rabbi Stephen Wise was very, very prominent in that, Ambassador Morgenthau, etc. And what they did is, because they had consulates in the Ottoman Empire and they had all these missionary stations, they were able to try to reach out and find some of the survivors and put them together. Now, a lot of people were never able to reconnect, and up until, in fact, I saw an announcement just last year in one of the Armenian newspapers in 2005 asking for information about a family member. So it was very difficult to do, but they tried to do it. And one of the most important legacies of American aid to the Armenians was the establishment of orphanages. And when you talked about the story about Rwanda, it reminded me, because the Near East Relief tried to gather up the Armenian orphans and the women that had been brought into Turkish and Kurdish and Arab homes to be raised as Muslims. So the few Armenian men that had still survived actually scoured the countryside for a couple years after the genocide to try to, it was an ingathering of Armenian orphans and Armenian widows. Now, sometimes the kids were so little they didn't remember anything. Some of them were scared, but nonetheless, thousands and thousands of widows and orphans were gathered, and the skills that they used to survive were needlework and lace and carpet weaving. And so I think it's a very interesting connection that at the end, here in the 21st century, people are still using those skills to survive. And that's how, on my mother's side, that's how my grandmother survived in the orphanage, was by doing Armenian needlework. Yes?
There are descendants of Armenians in modern-day Turkey. There's a minority that's left there and has some Armenian roots. As a whole, how would you describe the way they identify themselves and how they treat it?
The question is about the remnants of the Armenian community that's still in Turkey. There's about, the figures vary, but it's assumed there are about 60,000 Armenians still left in Turkey. Now, this is out of a population of over 2 million before the genocide. There's only about 60,000 left. Most of them are in Istanbul, the capital. There are a few in the interior, not many. Now, their psychological makeup is very complicated because for years and years, they have been living in Turkey. And some of them identify themselves with the Turkish people very closely. And the ones that don't have left, largely. But there are some Armenians in Turkey. For example, the editor of the local Armenian newspaper in Istanbul, Agos Hrantink, has been on trial recently several times because he has brought out the fact that he is not a Turk. And that was actually enough to get him thrown in jail because he was accused of denigrating the Turkish state. So the Armenian community in Turkey is a dwindling group. There are still, if not legal impediments, and there are some legal impediments still. For example, you can't repair any of the Armenian properties in Turkey, the churches, the schools, without permission of the state. And so a lot of them are left to decay and to fall apart, and there's not much they can do. And then, of course, on the popular level, there is still a fair amount of anti-Armenian sentiment. And you find it in racist jokes. You find it in some of the newspapers that actually talk about the Armenian citizens of Turkey as others, not as fellow citizens. And I think that's very interesting. And, for example, a few years ago, Human Rights Watch did a report on the Greek community in Istanbul, and the Greek community was very, very large. And they said never in all of their years of human rights work had they found a minority group so afraid to talk that even those Greeks that had gone to Greece but still had relatives in Turkey didn't want to talk about their lives in Turkey because they were afraid that the state would do something. So I think things are changing because Turkey is in accession talks to the EU. There's an increasing space, I think, in Turkish civil society for these debates, especially with a lot of the academics. And I should have mentioned Orhan Pamuk, who's the most prominent Turkish writer whose work has been translated into many different languages. He was actually also tried for denigrating the Turkish state because he mentioned to a newspaper in Switzerland that 1 million Armenians were killed and no one talks about it. And that was enough to land him with a lawsuit. So, but these people are speaking up. They're speaking out. They are reaching out to the Armenians that live in Turkey. There's a very interesting movement of people rediscovering their Armenian roots. So in the last few years, Turks and Kurds have started basically coming out of the closet and saying, we have Armenian roots. We have an Armenian grandparent, we have an Armenian grandparent, and it's now being talked about in Turkish society, and I think that's a very healthy development. And there have been several conferences in Turkey by universities on the Armenian question. Now, they still will not use the word genocide, and that for them is, there's also a very heavy psychological component on the Turkish side to acknowledge genocide. Because in the popular mind, genocide is equated with what? The Nazis. So for psychological reasons, they can't acknowledge that their ancestors could have ever done anything like that. And you'll hear quotes saying, "We are not that kind of people. We would never do anything like that." So there's a real heavy psychological burden on them, but it's clearly disproportionate because you can't equate the victim group with the victimizer group. But they have their own psychological impediments to overcome as well.
Could you elaborate a little bit more about the contemporary Armenian communities around the world? How many, what, and anything that you'd like to share with us?
The question was about Armenian communities around the world. There are between 7 and 8 million Armenians worldwide. There are only a little over 3 million in the Republic of Armenia itself, so there are more Armenians abroad than there are within the Republic. The largest communities are now in the United States, in North America with about probably 1 million, and Russia with about another 1 million, and then communities in places as far-flung as Australia and Uruguay and Argentina and Brazil and Germany and France and England. The communities in the Near East really took a hit in the latter part of the 20th century when civil war broke out in Lebanon, and Beirut had been the cultural capital of Armenian communities abroad, and the textbooks, the newspapers, the intellectual life of the Armenian community had been transferred to Beirut in the 1920s, the one survivors. And so from the 1970s on, when the civil war in Lebanon broke out, many of them left and came to France or the United States. And then the other large community in Iran also took a hit after the Islamic Revolution in 1979. So there's still a strong community in Iran, and they're actually quite remarkable in many ways, and we have some friends from Iran, Armenian friends from Iran here today, and they can tell you that many of the Armenians came to Iran in 1603 when Shah Abbas, so 400 years ago, when Shah Abbas deported the entire Armenian cities and brought them to his empire in Iran to work as artisans, etc. Now, 400 and some odd years, they're still consciously Armenian, which here in the United States, for example, we've only been around for about 100 years, and assimilation is rampant. So it's very interesting to see how different communities have reacted. And as I said in the lecture, one of the main components of Armenian identity is being Christian is one, but Christian in more of a cultural context, not necessarily really religious or church-going, but it's the institution of the church. And another important characteristic is the genocide, and that we are mostly descendants of victims of the genocide, and that is a strong component in Armenian identity. But Armenian identity abroad is also in the process of change, because for the last 15 years there's been an independent Armenian state, and it's the longest existing Armenian state since the Middle Ages. So Armenians have not had, the last Armenian kingdom fell in 1375, and then we had this brief period from 1918 to 1920. So Armenians are not accustomed to having a state, Armenians abroad. And so now they're starting to think of themselves more in terms of their relationship to the Republic of Armenia, but that's going to take probably another generation too. So.
I would like to stay for a moment with this theme about the Turkish denial. If we look to the Holocaust in World War II, we see that Germany very quickly came to the forefront, acknowledged its role, and as a result has really taken a rightful place among the Western nations and speaks with the moral authority of today's world. Speculate for a moment why you believe it is that the government of Turkey doesn't embrace that same philosophy.
Well, I think with the Nazi case, you have to remember that Germany was militarily defeated and occupied. And it was really the United States that pushed this denazification, right? And you had the Nuremberg trials. You had such overwhelming physical evidence that it was impossible to deny. But the Turkish case is much different because you didn't have the technology to record all of this. Although Turkey was defeated in the war, it was never really occupied for that long. The Allies soon fell out among each other, fighting over their imperialist designs in the Near East, and the Turks were able to take advantage of that and create this new republic. And the new republic that was created by Ataturk tried to distance itself as much as possible from the Ottoman Empire by saying, that was them, that's not us. And so over the years, there just has not been a push because of the things mentioned before, that the U.S. had a real strategic interest in keeping Turkey firmly in the Western alliance, and they never made an issue of it. So there really hasn't been any outside pressure until the accession talks with the EU have started to take place, that Turkey feels like it needs to address the question. But because Germany was, physically occupied and restructured, there was no way you couldn't, and also there was such guilt on the part of many of the Western powers, and especially, for example, American Jews, right? There was this tremendous guilt. And so they took it upon themselves to make sure that this stayed current. And then, of course, it doesn't hurt that the state of Israel was created, right? And so once you have a state that's able to use its state resources to make sure that this tragedy is not forgotten, the Armenian diaspora communities can never compete with the power of a state. So we can have a little commemoration. I can go to a synagogue like I did last night at Shomrei Torah. I can come here, but I can never compete with the millions of dollars that the Turkish state can spend on denying the Armenian genocide.
I think our time is up, but Robert, I'm sure, will be more than glad to answer any other questions that you might have. Once again,